there's lots of glasses, but it turns out we're really lucky to have silicon oxide as in terms of glass forming. There's only a few elements that form glasses. So there's boron oxide, there's silicon oxide, and then phosphorus oxide is a big one. And those are the main ones, I think, for forming glasses. But silicon oxide is sort of by far the best one. It really structurally is the best as well. Like boron oxide just dissolves in water, so you wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want pure boron oxide, but they do put boron oxide with silicon oxide, like Pyrex. It's sort of a classic mixture of boron oxide and silicon oxide. So the boron is used to minimize the thermal shock, and silicon oxide is robust. So mixing boron oxide, silicon oxide is sort of a big deal, and it was discovered quite a long time ago in terms of a very special glass with good thermal shock capabilities, so good mechanical properties. Yeah, I mean, we're really lucky to live on Earth with silicon oxide, I guess, in terms of for the glass industry. I don't know. There's not a better material for making glass. We're kind of lucky.
Okay, good. Let's just jump right into some of the more applications and engineering of glass then. Of course, we can see through it. Maybe let's start with the optical properties and
Yeah, I mean that.
why you can see through glass.
Yeah, so glass, of course, is probably one of the best optical properties materials out there. Basically, if you look at sort of transparent materials, that first of all, glass doesn't have any sort of boundaries. It like we talked about ceramics, we talked about gluing crystals together. As soon as you have a boundary, light's going to scatter off that boundary, could scatter back to you, or could just scatter just at a certain angle. And so it's going to have, it's going to be opaque. And so glass is perfect because the atoms are random, but there's no distinct boundaries within the glass. It's just inside the glass, you look one way, it's like, well, there's a bunch of random atoms, but I don't see any interfaces. And I look down the other side, and, like a ceramic, you would see an interface. Here, it's all looks the same. So there's no scattering of light. That's one of the big reasons why glass works so well. The only boundaries are the front face and the back face of the glass. That's it. Whereas in polycrystal materials, there's thousands of boundaries it scatters off of. Once you get rid of the boundaries, like glass has no boundaries, now the light can go through. And then the next thing you think about is at the atom scale. And can these atoms absorb light? And some atoms absorb light better than other atoms. Silicon oxide, none silicon nor oxygen really absorbs the light in the visible range. So then it basically just lets everything through. And so it has an incredible transparency. There's very little loss of light as the light passes through glass. And of course, probably the best example of that is an optical fiber where light can go, kilometers and still travel. And of course, that was a great development where the glass was ultra pure. They made it ultra pure and draw it down into a fiber. So yeah, that's sort of the ultimate when it comes to light transmission is fiber optics, which is something pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're not tubes that are shooting light through. It's just a solid fiber of glass through.
Yeah, essentially, it's very pure glass, and silicon oxide is a big part of it. There's some other elements as well, but silicon oxide is the big one.
And then I want to stick with glass, but is that why silicon oxide crystals are transparent as well? Because for the same reason that glasses, or is there something
Yeah,
different?
without getting into it too much, there's something called a band gap in all these materials. The band gap is the ability for an electron to jump from one band to another band. And when a light comes in, if the light has enough energy to make that electron jump, it'll absorb, right? And so silicon has a much smaller band gap, like almost 10 times lower band gap than silicon oxide. Silicon oxide has a huge band gap, so no matter what hits it, the energy of that light is not sufficient to make the electrons jump, so it won't absorb. It'll just basically allow to transmit. But silicon, it's small enough that you can get those light to go in and make those electrons jump, and they absorb, right? So that's one of the big differences between silicon and silicon oxide. in
Mhm.
terms of not silicon by itself looks almost like a metal.
And so that's more or less what people learn in their first chemistry class, where you talk about mostly gases.
And re-emitting, absorbing, re-emitting, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But
So it's
certainly
the same thing
absorbing.
for solids, and it's just that
Yep.
most solids have a whole bunch of ways to absorb or
We have
reflect
some
light.
different ways to do it, not separate atoms, but as groups of atoms, they absorb differently. And so
Okay.
then glass is pretty interesting because silicon oxide has this huge gap. And basically, then when the light goes through, it doesn't sort of make these electrons jump. So that's the first thing. But you can add things to glass, like iron, for example, is a good one, where iron will absorb certain wavelengths of light. And then that green glass you see, that's something that's pretty common. So the light, basically the red light, I guess, is getting absorbed and only allow the green to pass through. And so then yeah, so that's very special maybe to iron. I think cobalt is a very beautiful blue. So, that absorbs at a different wavelength to allow blue to pass through. So those are additives that each of these elements that are spread out within the glass will absorb.
Yeah. And you don't see it too much anymore, of course, because polymers can select for that very well. So,
Yeah, that's right. Polymers, they can do a lot these days for sure.
okay, but there it definitely is still some uses for glass. We don't have polymer windshields or windows in our house, things like that. Those are still made of glass.
We kind of have polymer windshields
Oh, is that right?
because it's layered, right? So like
Okay.
windshields have I don't know how many layers, but they'll have some polymer in between the glass to basically toughen it up. And so if the glass breaks, there's a polymer layer that kind of keeps it all together. So windshields are definitely made of a layered composite, I believe, with polymer glass and maybe polymer glass. I just don't know the structure too much, but certainly polymers are used quite a bit in some of these structural applications for
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
Okay. But you still have glass in it, right? And why
Oh,
do we
absolutely.
have
Yeah.
glass instead of just a pure polymer for things like that? So what does glass do in terms of, we talked about the optical part of it, but the mechanical part, because we make these big windows, big tough windshields, aquariums, those are still,
Yeah.
big thick glass. Yeah, yeah, right. Phones
That's the
even.
big one.
Why do we have glass screens instead of polymer screens on our phone?
Yeah, so glass screens are pretty interesting. Like on cell phones, the Gorilla Glass is one that's pretty common. And so what they'll do for the glass that's on your cell phone is, obviously, you can drop it. Sometimes it will break, but a lot of times it won't. And the reason why is because they've made these glasses really strong. Basically, what will happen is you'll have a thin piece of glass, and we talked about glass being mostly silicon oxide, but there are other things they add into it, like sodium they'll add in, and that helps lower the melting point, make it easy to process. And then what they'll do is they'll take a solution of potassium, and potassium is a bigger ion. And then what they'll do is they'll exchange the potassium for the sodium. So they'll bring potassium in, sodium leaves. And so what's really interesting about that is now you take a big ion, put it into where the small guy was, and he creates this really compressive, because it's squeezing it in there. And so it makes the top layer of the glass in compression. And so then it resists any scratching, any cracking at that first part. So it's an ion exchange glass, and it's really what makes Gorilla Glass so special and so tough to break, because it's already got compression. And most glass and all ceramics normally break in tension. And so if you can keep the surface in compression, it goes a long way to making the ceramic more mechanically stable. I guess the other one to think about, ceramics and glass people have always thought about, how to manage stress within the material. Another good example is Corel. So, for example, in Corel, you have multi layers, and the outside layer also is a glass, and it basically cools at a different rate. It has, and I don't know all the details, but basically it'll cool. So the outside's in compression and the inside's in tension. And so, because obviously you have to balance the stresses, it's not like the plate's moving around or anything. And so you have to balance the stresses. So the outside is in compression, inside in tension, and that really makes for a strong plate. They don't scratch, they don't break easily. But once you break something that's a Corel dish, it explodes. Why? Because as soon as that crack makes it to the center's of tension, it just pulls itself apart. So, these dishes are pretty amazing until they're not. And then they'll just kind of blow up all over the place because of this huge tension in the middle. And so, yeah, people control in glass the stress states of the glass. Tempered glass is another one, right? So that's a way to form glass that has compression on the outside, and so that's what they call tempered glass.
Okay,
For
and tempered steel you hear about as
yeah,
well is probably the
yeah.
same process but with metal. Okay. And then like why does it, like if you you'll see videos of people who like chip the corner of a big pane of glass or something, or maybe you slam the door or something and it just like spiders all the way through the whole thing. Is that the same principle?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
okay.
So basically the inside's sitting there just poised to break apart, and you hope you never get to that point where the crack makes it to the center where it's in tension. And they actually designed these things also to break into small pieces. So they designed the stress states so you don't have these big jagged pieces. It just kind of almost is like a bunch of little pieces, and it's less dangerous as well. So there's a lot of technology that goes into designing stress states of glass to do things like that.
A really dramatic example I've seen online. There's some cool YouTube videos of where they drop molten glass into a bucket of water and it forms these drops that are like super hard. You bang on them with a hammer, they shoot them with bullets and stuff. They're really cool. I definitely recommend people check out these
What do they
videos.
call those? The
Prince Rupert drop.
Prince Rupert drops, right? Yeah, and
Yeah.
you kind of just touch the tail a little bit, and the thing just goes.
Yeah, it just explodes
Right.
then. Just one little crack. Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a great example of how you have the outside of that Prince Rupert drop in compression, and as soon as you break through that compressive layer, you get to the point where it just explodes.
Yeah, let's stick with glass a little bit. Fiber. So fiberglass, and you talked about fiber optics. These are both glass, but they're like flexible.
Yeah, right, right. So thinking about mechanical properties. So if you think about stress on some body, the thinner it is, you can bend it more and have less stress at the surface. So it really is a mechanics problem. So it's independent of the type of material. It's just the way the stress state of the material is. If it's really thin, then you're not having much stress at the surface. Even though you're bending it down, there's not much tension at the surface. And the thinner you go for a given bend radius, you'll have less and less stress at the surface. So for a fiber, you can actually wrap it around your finger, mainly because it's so thin that there's very little stress at that outside surface. Whereas if you try to take something that was really thick and try to wrap that around, it's going to be so much stress it'll just break. So it really is more of a mechanics thing than, I guess, a material thing. I will say one thing though, fibers are made in a way that there's no defects, right? So all around that circumference, if you draw a fiber down, it's pristine glass and there's very little defects on that surface. Whereas if you bend the plate, the first place is going to break is at the edges. So if you cut the glass, you're going to put little defects in those edges all along the edges. And any of those little defects, as soon as you put a little bit of stress on, they'll propagate and crack. So fibers are pretty special because you're bending and there's no cut defects in any of them and around that circumference. So it really has to do not only with sort of the stress state, but also there's just no initiating flaws or defects like in a flat plate where you have a finite flat plate. There's going to be some edge. That edge is going to have a defect, and that's where you're going to get your crack started. The other thing they kind of do, though, I think they coat the fibers with a little bit of polymer just to kind of keep the defects down as well. Because you put a little nick in there and it'll just go. Yeah, that's one thing about glass. If you just start with a little bit of a nick or a crack, it'll just propagate.
Yeah, fiber optics are probably even thicker, I would think, than like fiberglass insulation, or those just feel like cloth, like they're so thin and flexible. And
Because like a lot of these fibers are made, very quickly, and they're put into like a glass wool or something like that. Or sometimes they'll add it to the green board that they use in the computers, and that the fiberglass will be added there. And of course, fiberglass is used as a structural material when you mix it with epoxy,
right,
right? The fiber.
right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do glass cooktops. Talk to me about those because I know you like them.
Yeah, glass ceramics. So now
Oh,
we've talked
it's a
about,
ceramic? You want to do ceramics first, and we can combine
no,
them?
it is a glass ceramic.
Okay.
So I'm doing glass and ceramics.
Okay.
So what's really neat about cooktops is they start out as a glass. And so, you pour and you start it out. But then what they'll do is a special heat treatment process that they'll grow these really tiny, tiny crystals. And basically all the glass will be transformed into a crystal. And that's a very special material because it's really tough and it's very mechanically durable. And so that's why cooktops are just made with these. And so they look like glass, but they're called glass ceramics. It was actually developed by a scientist who kind of made a little bit of a mistake one night and left the glass in too long during heat treatment and basically formed this glass ceramic. And he pulled out a furnace and he dropped it and it didn't break. And after further investigation, they realized that the glass basically turned into a crystalline material, but the crystals were so small that it really made the material mechanically really strong. So I think we talked about how little scratches will cause glass to break. What's really neat about glass ceramic is if you have a little scratch, that scratch will stop because it'll get blunted because that crack will kind of move along that boundary and basically lose its energy. So glass ceramics are really interesting because they're super tough. They'll take a lot of mechanical beating, a lot of thermal shocking, that sort of thing. So yeah, so cooktops are actually ceramics, but they started life out as a glass. So yeah, that's a pretty nice story. And that's actually a fairly recent development. You think about glass being around 3,000 years or something. Glass ceramics have been around maybe 100.